to Score Study Notes. My name is Sam Hollister, and today I'm going to look at Dvorak's 8th Symphony. I'd like to try something a little different this time. I'm going to focus on one very specific question rather than looking at an entire work. When we get into things like Dvorak's 8th Symphony, there's way too much to talk about. But I have one organizing question, and I think it'll be a bit of a shorter video. I'm interested in where the second theme is in this first movement. I think there are many candidates, and there are reasons why we might think of different options as the second theme. And I'm interested in why it matters. How does choosing where we think the second theme is, or what the story about the second theme is, affect how we interpret and perform, or as an audience member, even feel about the music? So that's the goal today, and hopefully it will be a bit more compact than the first two videos I've done so far. As always, I suggest you follow along with a score, but it's totally fine if you don't have your own. I'll put a link to the PDF from IMSLP in the description. And hopefully it's still an interesting video, even if you don't follow along with the score. I just think it can be helpful because I'll throw out some rehearsal letters and measure numbers and things like that. The three candidates that I would argue could be thought of as secondary themes in this exposition are these three ideas. The first is the pickup to measure 67. And so forth. The second idea is at letter D. This is measure 77. And the third option that we might try to hear as a second theme is at letter E, or measure 97. That's the one that sounds like... So how does Dvorak string these three themes together? How can we decide which one is meant to be the second theme? Well, let's take a look back at letter C to understand the context. At letter C, we have something that really looks like it could be the primary theme. It's the same theme we heard the flute introduce earlier as the primary theme, but it quickly diverts to a new location with a new key on the horizon. Let's listen. We have a 6/4 chord, a cadential 6/4 chord, looking toward the key of B minor, with this F sharp pedal in the bass. So Dvorak takes this tonic of G and slams it down a half step, and we get a dominant pedal looking toward a new key of B minor. Now, do we get the key of B minor? Well, let's see. From the 4th bar of C, then the clarinet, then the bassoon, echoing this 6/4 chord, this expectant chord. Are we going to get there? The viola, horn. Okay, now we have a dominant chord. And that F sharp from the dominant chord sustains in the first horn. They hold as everyone else cuts away to silence. Now, a moment like this, in a sonata structure where we've seen the transition, we've seen a move towards a new key, and we get a dominant chord of that new key, and then the texture clears to almost nothing, or sometimes even absolutely nothing. This is what we would think of as the medial caesura. In the sonata structure, medial caesura is exactly that idea. The transition has taken us to a new location with a new key. Are we going to get there? Are we going to get a new theme? And then there's a moment to collect. There's a rest, there's a breath, a caesura, a gap, and then the second theme appears in this new key, the secondary key. Okay, so from this dominant F sharp, certainly we're going to get our second theme. That's what's in our minds when we get to measure 67. But here's our first candidate for second theme. We are not in the key of B minor. We started with a B minor 6/4 chord, but then immediately we find ourselves on an E dominant 7th chord. Now, if this were tonally functional, it would be 5 of A. And in fact, by the end of the phrase I played, we get an A major cadence. the second half of this theme, if it is a theme, now we have a dominant chord with A in the bass, so looking towards D major. Okay, we're no longer in the world of B minor. We had an E dominant 7th chord, now we have an A dominant 7th chord with a 9th, and we're looking at a potential key of D. Oh, this is very strange. So what's the logic? Why would we have the option for a theme and then just sort of not give us that theme in the key we expected? This is why I don't hear this as the second theme, because if it were the second theme, it would need to respect the medial caesura in some way. But it's as though Dvorak takes this chance that he gave himself in measure 66 of the medial caesura. We could have a theme in B minor, and then instead of actually writing the theme said, I don't know. Maybe I'll find something else. I'll look somewhere else for a new key. Okay, now we have A as an option, but immediately he says, oh, now I'm going to create a dominant for something else, D major. Now, why would he abandon this beautiful option for a second theme at measure 67? Why would he pivot like that? Well, if you think about the introduction to the symphony, dark G minor, lonesome, somber, maybe even fateful or fatalistic. Of course, we then get a primary theme that seemed to pay no attention to that gloominess. But there's that kind of, in the back of our minds, we know that there was that somber G minor world that we came from. So there's a bit of the telos or the story or the intent of avoiding that minor mode. I think maybe Dvorak teased himself up for a second theme here at 66, but because he teed himself up for a minor second theme, his goal is now to avoid the minor theme. Oh, wait a second. I don't want to go back to the world of the somber and the gloomy. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could find the dominant, like its standard classical sonata would do? Like, can't we find D major and have a second theme in D major? So he goes on a little journey. And now he gets the dominant of D major. Oh, maybe he actually is going to create another option for medial caesura and now a secondary theme in D major instead. That's the idea at measure 71. And now we again have our dominant of D major until the third beat of measure 76. Now the pickup to letter D is where we would have our theme in D major. And what do we have instead? We have our second candidate for secondary theme. Now that's very straightforwardly in B minor. This is the original secondary key that Dvorak for a moment tried to find a detour around, and yet here we are back creating a theme that's firmly rooted. I mean, look at the basses. Forgive me, I need to tune that note. So now this is truly a theme in a second key of B minor. He teed himself up a second time for a hopefully better second key of D major, one that avoids those implications of that introduction in the minor realm, but he found his way, unfortunately, to a theme in B minor. So there's so much storytelling and much to interpret about that section and the narrative of what's happening. As we conduct or perform or listen to the piece, we hear an attempt to find something better, to strive for a different reality in the second theme, and then find our way back to a minor second theme anyway. And that's so important because everything that led up to it then gets a completely new meaning. You know, that longer just a pretty theme with fun colors and textures, but this is an active attempt to escape the almost doom of a second theme in B minor. Can we do something else? And then after all of that attempt, and even the optimism of maybe finding a theme in D major, you can imagine Dvorak actually took his second option and made a second theme in D major, and all would be well with the world. But even after striving for that other reality, we wind up in the key we were trying to avoid. So there's so much storytelling happening there already. And now the question is, what's the next best option? If you have sort of wound up in the second theme already, and it's not ideal, you know, it's minor, it's reminiscent of that somber world from the introduction. Well, we can try to correct the theme after it's already begun, or overwrite it with something even better, even though it's pretty darn clear that this is a second theme from the moment we get to letter D. And this is exactly what Dvorak attempts to do, for instance, from measure 85. So we hear a lot of fully diminished seventh chords, a lot of dissonances, a lot of sweeping motions in the orchestra. The music is intensifying, the harmonic rhythm is accelerating. It's as though Dvorak is attempting to find a solution yet again to this feeling of being trapped in the minor realm. Okay, now where do we go from here? From measure 89, we have... Goodness, the bar before E gives away that Dvorak may just achieve B major. Now that would be a solution, a different kind of solution to B minor. If he was trying to avoid B minor the first time by looking towards other major keys, like we were looking towards A major and then we're looking towards D major, we never got either. We wound up back in B minor. Maybe the solution is to accept that B is the tonal center for our second theme or our second key, but at least we can try to make it B major. That's exactly what Dvorak gives us 4 before E. We get a dominant of B. Now the second violin's in a moment of extreme tension, and the first and second horns just sort of trill and hover around that F sharp, that dominant of B, like what's gonna happen next? Now the bassoons give it away. Now in that lead-in, we already heard notes from B major, not B minor. If we were headed instead to B minor, the bassoon would have had to play. And now we are back in B minor, but instead, of course, the bassoons have this lift and this optimism. It's so important that we hear the bassoons there so that E isn't just a surprise, but is actually arrived at organically by this little anticipation in the bassoons, and we get the theme at E, the third candidate for second theme. In B major, isn't that great? So we've had this beautiful escape to B major, and then the orchestra all comes around and says, this is what we've been waiting for, this is what we wanted. But there's a problem, because that final cadence in B major at measure 109 is already basically the end of the exposition. We only have this very quick turnaround with the trumpets. And then a collapse to B minor. And then to G, and then eventually at letter F, that resolves to what becomes the development, which begins with that introductory material again in G minor. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it means that that resounding perfect authentic cadence at measure 109, it's really the EEC, or the essential expositional closure. If that's a term that you've seen thrown around in the sonata world, some people use it, some people don't. It's that cadence where we finally achieved the goal of the sonata's exposition, which is to produce a second theme in a new key and cadence in that key with a perfect authentic cadence to say, done, we did it. We have our second theme, our second key, and we've done it, we've made it. There's no other option for that closing cadence prior to this moment in measure 109. Now, again, why is that a problem? Well, that means that this is the end of the second theme. This is the goal of the second theme, is measure 109. Well, that means E is the second theme from a traditional perspective. That means this idea at E is the one that worked. This is the one that got us across the finish line. But hang on a second. At least if you're following along with my thought process, we were convinced this at letter D was the second theme. Now, lots of theorists have different ways of describing this multi-theme phenomenon. Some people in the world of Jim Hepikowski, for instance, refer to this idea as the trimodular block, or at least you could make an argument that there's a relationship to this TMB or trimodular block. I think the most important thing to observe is that there are actually more than just three thematic ideas. Typically, a trimodular block refers to the first attempt at the second theme, the retransition to regroup and try it again, and then the corrected version of the second theme. That would be letter D, something like measure 85, and then letter E. Those would be the tri-modules, or the three modules. What's so interesting to me is that it's more than that. Measure 67 is on our radar too. The first idea of the medial caesura was abandoned with something that almost is like a theme, but really is searching for other new horizons. So it's like a tetramodular, I don't know if you want to invent a term for it. There are four different significant moments. You know, I said there are three themes, but there's also this measure 85 phenomenon where we start to regroup and agitate towards a fix to this B minor theme. As you can see, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct to say letter E is the second theme, or that it's correct to say letter D is the second theme. I think there's a dialogue between D and E where D is a first proper attempt at the second theme, and where letter E is a reattempt, especially given that the two bars leading into letter E are fixated on this dominant of B, like another medial caesura, like another dominant question mark, like what's going to happen next. And then eventually we get our B major final secondary theme idea. So it's not that D is right, it's not that E is right, it's that we have to hear both D and E as second theme attempts with different qualities, different narrative attachments. Letter D is almost a reluctant slinking back to B minor after an attempt to pick a different secondary key. Maybe we can do D? No. So reluctantly we slink back. So we can begin to make interpretive decisions, like this pickup to letter D. Maybe we don't want this to be immediate, but instead to convey that feeling of reluctance, like must I really make this second theme be in B minor? Must I go back to that dark world of the minor mode? So maybe we can stretch that initial pickup. And then we're in it, so we don't have to do it every time, but we might want to dramatize that moment. And of course it means that something like measure 85, this agitation that tries to push away from that B minor second theme and maybe create a different second theme, which will eventually be the B major one, we want it to feel very agitated. And so how does Dvorak write that? Well, he seems to write it with pyrotechnic kinds of dynamics. We have the forte piano in the violins with a crescendo. Can't, of course, do it quite well on the piano, but you can imagine. Now a forzando, and then finally a forte arrival. So 3 different ways of notating this peak dynamic of these little 2-bar phrases for the violins. All the while, this figure in the low strings has its own separate kind of pyrotechnic dynamics. We have to hear the independence of these textures so that there's density in our ears of this thing happening, this thing happening. It would be a shame if the violin swells sounded exactly like the lower string swells. They're not notated the same, let alone the fact that we want this density of agitation to come across in the texture. Then we get to letter E, and with this idea, with this analysis in our minds, letter E is like a Hail Mary. It's like a Hail Mary that works, a Deus Ex Machina, but at first we don't know that it's going to work. It's almost too good to be true. And that diminuendo in the 4th bar of E is almost as if to say, okay, well, I'm just gonna wrap this up right now. I'm gonna find a cadence, and we're gonna end this thing, because I can't even believe we made it this far without a problem. And then the 5th bar of E, the whole orchestra says, yes, that was great. So there's so much storytelling to that, and if we just sort of have a generic chorale sound at letter E, sort of, there's a lot of triadic harmony moving by 4ths and 5ths. We might think this is kind of like a Bach chorale or something very straightforward, Monteverdi, but it's not. It's hushed with anticipation and kind of a quiet disbelief that have we really made it to B major? Are we really going to have a solution to this issue? I can't play with vibrato on the piano and with sort of a hushed intensity, but we can on wind instruments. So hopefully this gives you a little insight into the way I think about these kinds of analytic questions. It's not interesting to me to say D is the 2nd theme or E is the 2nd theme. What's interesting to me is to understand the dialogue between those 2 different readings and to see within the fingerprint of Dvorak's writing, harmonically, structurally, and orchestrationally, texturally, to see the fingerprint of that story, of the drama, of trying to find a 2nd theme that is satisfactory for Dvorak, in avoiding the somberness of the introduction, in achieving something that's memorable and thematically interesting for the listener. I hope you've enjoyed this little investigation into a small, tiny question about a very big piece. And I hope that even though I'm not putting an entire discussion of all of Dvorak 8 into this video, that this conversation might be helpful for you in informing how you listen to or play or analyze the rest of the piece as well. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, please like it, leave a comment with ideas for videos you might like to see in the future, and if you think you have a friend who might enjoy the channel, feel free to share it with them. I'm really thrilled with the little community we've built so far, and I hope to keep seeing it grow, so thank you very much. See you next time.